Russia might not be the biggest country on the planet. However, it is one of the biggest countries in the world. So, it is easy to believe that whatever affects it will have a ripple effect. You see, due to the war in Ukraine, Russia could collapse. We hope things do not come to this. However, if Russia collapses, the world will be affected in ways that lots of people never imagined. Regardless of this, Europe doesn't seem scared of what could happen in the eventual collapse of Russia. Russia is at war with Ukraine. It thought it was going to win this war in a short time. Sadly, things are not going according to plan. It has moved a significant part of its weapons to Ukraine, and due to this, its most recent Victory Day parade was quite a shadow of itself. Speaking about Russia's Victory Day parade, this is a parade to celebrate Russia's victory over the Nazis in the Second World War. Of course, this victory is worth celebrating. Sadly, it reminds the Russians of the fact that the victory in the Second World War was their last. Not many people realize this. However, since the Russians defeated the Nazis in the Second World War, they have not been victorious in another war. The war in Ukraine might seem like the only war the Russians are struggling to win, but really, it is one of the wars that the Russians have not been able to conclude. Not many people have spoken about the fact that Russia hasn't won a war in forever, but the leader of the Wagner mercenary group has spoken out. He posted a tweet on social media stating that the Victory Day parade isn't necessarily for present-day Russians. Rather, it is for their grandparents. And present-day Russians need to earn their victory. And one way to do this is to make something out of the war in Ukraine. Well, with the way things are going, this might be quite difficult, as those on the war front don't seem to have as much ammunition as needed to win the war in Ukraine. The situation of the war in Ukraine is quite a big deal, but it is not the only problem Russia has to deal with. There's also the financial problem that Russia is dealing with. One might assume that it is all Russia's fault that its economy is in a bad place, but it is the fault of the many sanctions it has been hit with by the West. With the many challenges Russia is facing, there are questions about how long it can stay strong in the face of overwhelming financial challenges. That's not all. There are also questions about how long it will continue as a state without a collapse. It might be difficult to understand the possibility of Russia collapsing, but there are quite a few reasons Russia could collapse. There could be a civil war, a political disintegration, or a revolution. When we talk about Russia collapsing, we might consider or even expect a financial collapse, but that's not exactly what we are talking about. Russia might be in a bad spot financially. However, the likely collapse of Russia is more political than financial. And with recent happenings, Russia might be quite close to a collapse. You see, in the various regimes, there have been political issues in Russia after wars. The first was after the Cold War. We'll see more of this in a moment, but in the meantime, kindly like and share this video. Also, please subscribe to this channel to see more videos like this. The most recent time the Soviet Union went through a major shakeup was after the Cold War. We might call this event a shakeup. However, it was the Soviet Union breaking up. There was a likelihood that not everyone watching this video is aware of what happened during the breakup of the Soviet Union. However, those who can remember what happened can attest to the fact that the world was shocked. No one saw it coming. The Soviet Union was very powerful and large, so its collapse was as big as its size. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the various regions that were so large and powerful went to their separate ways and became republics. At the time the Soviet Union collapsed, there was nothing Putin could do. This is quite well known. Well, Putin is in power now, and since coming into power, he has made attempts at strengthening Russia. And what he has done is get involved in some wars he perhaps had no real business getting involved in. And just like the Cold War brought about a massive breakup of the Soviet Union, Russia's invasion of Ukraine could just be the reason we might see a collapse of Russia. As much as it looks like common knowledge that there is a link between the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, some folks might choose to consider these events two distinctly separate events. Well, you might be one of them. However, if you have any idea what the Russo-Japanese War was all about and how it led to the collapse of the Tsarist Empire, it might begin to dawn on you how Russia's attack on Ukraine could cause a collapse. Well, this collapse might not be as big as those of the past, as present-day Russia is not as powerful as the Soviet Union or the Tsarist Empire. However, if it collapses, its fall will be great. The collapse of the Soviet Union is a lot more recent than that of the Tsarist Empire, so you might be able to relate better to it. Nonetheless, what happened in the Tsarist Empire is not unknown. You see, before its collapse, the Tsarist Empire was at war. However, it began struggling to fund the war. This struggle became so big that it abandoned its soldiers to their fates. Well, knowing they had been abandoned to whatever would befall them, the soldiers, alongside the peasants, rose against the government. And this was the end of the Tsarist Empire. The collapse of the Tsarist Empire birthed a couple of nations you likely know well. Included among them are Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. As much as these nations enjoyed a level of liberty after the end of the Tsarist Empire, their freedom was short-lived, as they soon got incorporated back into the Soviet Union. Well, this lasted for a while, and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, these countries made it a point to join NATO. This was their way of ensuring they never had to be pulled back into any form of a union with Russia. Present-day Russia and the war in Ukraine may not be like the Cold War. However, it is a lot like the Tsarist Empire, and its collapse might just be like that of the Tsarist Empire. Just like the war championed by the Tsarist Empire, in which the soldiers turned against the government, with everything taking place in Ukraine, Russian soldiers could get fed up and turn against the Kremlin. We hope it doesn't get to this. Well, if this happens, there will be a great deal of instability in Eastern Europe. But the West just might not be affected as much. Of course, since Russia sells oil and wheat, you can tell everyone will be affected. But as soon as the different regions that make up present-day Russia recover from the effects of this collapse, life might just be back to normal. Ukraine, with the backing of NATO, is doing all that it can to resist the Russians. But for how long will it be able to hold on? You see, after Russia attacked Ukraine, most people expected this war to be over just after it started. But strangely, that wasn't how things turned out. The Ukrainians were able to put up so much resistance that it felt like the Russians would be unable to make any progress. Well, contrary to what several people assumed, Russia is making progress, although slow. This progress will count for a lot in the end. Ukraine is under a lot of pressure right now, and if it can hold on for any longer, maybe the Russians will get tired and pull back. This is very unlikely though, but if the Russians do not come back, those at the forefront might get tired of a prolonged battle and turn against the Russian government. Now, there is a possibility of this happening, however, it is still very unlikely. There are many ways this war could turn out, and the most likely thing to happen is that the Russians will overrun Ukraine. This is unfortunate, and if things play out this way, Ukraine will not be the only country affected. Other countries that Putin believes should be a part of Russia will not be left out. It might be difficult to tell how far Putin will go to crush Ukraine and send a message to NATO and its allies. But with how prolonged this war is, if things do not go in Putin's favor, instead of dealing with a revolution, he might prefer to bring nuclear weapons into the game. The world hopes it doesn't get to this, but Putin is not a man who can be predicted, so he might just go to great lengths to keep his government intact. No one knows what the outcome of the Russian invasion of Ukraine will be. However, Ben Hodges, a US soldier who worked with NATO, appears to know where this war is headed. He thinks Ukraine will be victorious, and Europe is being unnecessarily cautious. But Europe doesn't see what he sees, and he knows just why. While speaking about Europe's reason for being cautious, Hodges said, "They think that if Ukraine liberates Crimea, that will lead to the collapse of the regime of Russian President Vladimir Putin, or that Putin will think he has no choice but to use a nuclear weapon to prevent that from happening. I think those are two false, unfounded fears. I hope it does lead to the collapse of the Putin regime. It's not something we should fear, it's something we should plan. I think there is a very real possibility that certain European countries will insert themselves. I can imagine Poland, even France, and some others in some way saying, we can't afford to do it. Here we are in April, and the Russians are oozing out. Why is that? I think it's because that's the best the Russians can do. They cannot knock Ukraine out of the war. That's why I feel fairly confident that the mission for Ukrainian General Oleksandr Syrskyi for the next several months is to stabilize this as much as he can, to buy time for Ukraine to grow the size of the army, to rebuild the defense industry of Ukraine, as well as give us time to find more ammunition for them. I think of 2024 as a year of industrial competition, so the army has got to buy time. So Ben Hodges has his opinion on what direction he thinks the war in Ukraine will go and how it will affect the Russians. He is an expert, and he just might be right. But what do you think about the war in Ukraine and the likely collapse of Russia? Kindly tell us in the comment section below. And that's how far we can take you today. See you in the next video.